If the air conditioning can be switched off, please. Yeah, thank you. So what you just heard is the third and fourth stanzas of Vande Mataram. The first two, as you know, is our national song, but there are three more stanzas. The third, fourth, and fifth. This was the third and fourth. This is important because these are the stanzas that were very often sung to the gallows by the revolutionaries when they were being hanged. So these are important stanzas. They were sung. This particular version was sung by put together by my younger son Dhruv and by my wife Smita. And the idea was to give you a flavor of why this. First of all, many people don't even know and never heard these stanzas. And when you hear it, you can clearly feel the power of these words. These are very clearly derived from strong Shakta imagery, i.e. from the Shakti tradition of Hinduism. And I'm going to start with this because in many ways people in misplaced idea of secularism forget the enormous influence in misplaced idea of secularism, forget the enormous influence that that Hindu revivalism had on the freedom struggle. Do remember what we are dealing with here. After the Great Revolt of 1857-58, all the traditional elite resistance to British colonial rule had basically fallen apart, right? Indians generally had accepted that the British now ruled the country. There were the odd revolts here and there by Birsa Munda in what is now Jharkhand, or by the Manipuri elite in 1890 or thereabouts. But really there was no serious resistance to British rule. And in that situation, there was a great feeling of civilization being under threat and religion being under threat. This was a very important part of the conversation. In fact, Lala Lajpat Rai writes in many of his writings that the youth in the 1880s, 1890s, that's all they talked about. And out of that milieu, many responses came. Some of the responses were social reform type responses that you at least hear about, like, for example, the Brahmo movement and so on. But what is less talked about is the power and imagery of Hindu revivalism that becomes a very important thing in the 1890s. Now, this shows through in many, many ways, one of them being, of course, Tilak's revival of Ganpati Puja. Now, Ganpati Puja is not a new thing. It was in the Maratha period an important festival, but by the late 19th century, it had become a very minor festival which was done at home, almost apologetically, in a world where missionaries were always ranting against idolatry. And Tilak basically brings it out forefront and revives it as a way of mobilizing people against the British. So the Ganpati Puja that you see in Maharashtra, but now more widely, is very much a modern construct. Obviously drawing on a more ancient tradition, but a modern construct for political mobilization. Now this happens in various ways as well. The Arya Samaj is another driver of this. But in many places, a major part of this driving force was drawing on Shaktiism as a source of inspiration. And we just heard before this session, the session on Durgavati. So it is important to remember that these image of Durga as such finds its way in many ways into the imagery of the freedom struggle. Now, out of this comes the armed resistance to British rule. Now, of course, there had always been armed resistance to British rule, going back to the beginning, whether it's in the 18th century resistance, the early 19th century from the Marathas, the Sikhs, and so on. But the revolutionary movement that starts out at the turn of the century is a thoroughly modern movement in some ways. It it is not an attempt to go back to the past. The revolutionaries were very much into creating a modern India. They were modernists. They wanted a democratic republic based on universal suffrage. In fact, it is the revolutionaries, rather than the Congress, which thought of India first as a democratic republic based on universal suffrage. The Congress, till basically the end of the 1920s, was still basically demanding at best small concessions and maybe dominion status. But the revolutionaries also drew upon an earlier era of resistance. Shivaji particularly was a very important character in their sort of mental map. And of course, as I mentioned, Shaktism. And this happens, of course, you can hear when you hear the Vande Mataram, you know, many Muslims refuse to sing it, saying that it is it's dedicated to Durga. It is, because it is very much derives from Shakti iconography. In fact, Durga herself and all the Tripura Sundari, i.e. Durga, Lakshmi and Saraswati, the initiation rites of the revolutionaries. Most of the revolutionaries, when they were initiated into the movement, they would go through this rite in which they would swear to fight for the liberation of Bhavani Bharati. And they would do it in front of an image of a form of Shakti, whether it's Bhavani or Durga or Kali, holding a Gita or other holy book in one hand and a sword or revolver in the other hand. So this is a very important thing to remember, because we are in a city where in some ways the intellectual font and father of that, of this resistance came to reside, and Sri Aurobindo. Of course, he was then called Aurobindo Ghosh. Unfortunately, the role of Sri Aurobindo or Aurobindo Ghosh as the father of our freedom struggle, and specifically of the revolutionary armed strain of our freedom struggle, has been largely forgotten, very often ignored even by his supposed followers. But in fact, he was the father of, he was one of the fathers of our freedom movement, and he was specifically the intellectual font from which the revolutionary movement drew its inspiration. Now, sadly, after independence, the story of India's freedom struggle from the armed lineage was deliberately suppressed. It happens, not surprisingly, because another group, another lineage of the freedom struggle, the Nehruvian lineage, I won't call them the Gandhian lineage, because Gandhi died very early in the story. But the Nehruvian lineage came to power, and they systematically tried to increase the importance, their own importance in the story. That's human. But what is not, I think, excusable was the fact that they then went and deliberately tried to suppress the story of what the revolutionaries in particular had done. And this is sad because of, and particularly the systematic way they did it. This is very sad because as some of you have already started reading my book about the revolutionaries actually were an extraordinary movement involving tens of thousands of people keeping up armed resistance to British occupation over half a century. This is not some small group of people, as you may get the impression from reading our history books. The history books haven't completely wiped them out, because this is very recent history, so you can't actually wipe out the memory of Subhash Bose or Bhagat Singh or Chandrasekhar Azad or Savarkar and so on. But you will get the impression from that, you know, okay, there were these occasional acts of resistance, heroic, etc., let's them give a pat on the back, but in fact had no impact on the overall unfolding of history or of the freedom struggle. This is absolutely not true. And as I've tried to show through my book, you cannot even understand the non-violent movement if you do not understand the armed resistance. In fact, inside the Congress itself, the revolutionaries had a very powerful voice. So much so that the revolutionaries were able to elect their own, i.e. Netaji Subhash Bose, to the presidency against the explicit opposition of Mahatma Gandhi. So even within the Congress, the revolutionaries were a very powerful bloc and were quite capable of winning elections. Incidentally, this wasn't just about Subhash Bose. This has happened many occasions before. One of those occasions, of course, Sri Aurobindo was involved. This is in the Surat session of the Congress, where we are now told, those who at least delve into that period, be told that there was a lot of friction within the Congress between the so-called extremists and the so-called moderates. The use of those terms itself is interesting, because you get the impression that the likes of Lal Bal Pal were somehow extremists because they were demanding independence, and the moderates were nice, reasonable chaps because they were asking for small crumbs from the British table. So, in my book, again, I have tried to change these terms and in fact use terms which Sri Aurobindo would use for them. The Lal Bal Pal, and of course he was from that same group, and an important person in that group, by the way. Sri Aurobindo would call them the nationalists, and he would call the opposing team the loyalists. So if you had to rewrite this history books, you would begin talking about that period and the tussle within the Congress as the tussle between the nationalists and the loyalists. Which brings me to another point which comes, hopefully will come through in my book, is the role played by a large group of people who I call collaborators, who actually collaborated actively with the British. After all, at even the peak of British rule in India, there were only a few 100,000 of these people, and an even smaller group would have been armed, a few more able to be in the administration. So there were, at no point in time were there a very large number of British officials, army and other people to be able to dominate a country of our size and our population. The reason they were able to do this is because there always was a sizable group of people who were collaborators. And sadly, again, very little is written about this collaborator class. Do remember that when firing was ordered on Indian protesters and freedom fighters during, let's say, the naval revolt of 1946, within living memory, incidentally, then the firing was very often, the firing was of course done by Indian police or troops or whatever, but even the ordering was very often done by young officers of the Imperial Police Service. So there was, and these young officers of the Imperial Police Service were Indians. Do remember this. So Indians have repeatedly collaborated with foreign occupiers to perpetuate our subjugation. This happened during the Turco-Mongol occupation of the country, and Nandini was talking about it earlier. This also happened, incidentally, during British rule, and ironically, even after independence. So this is one of the very sad parts of, if you read the epilogue of my book, and I'm going to talk a little bit more before we open it up for Q&A, because I think some of the conversation will be much more interesting in a Q&A. But one of the things that comes through very clearly is that independence happens, the Nehruvians come to power. Yes, of course, they deliberately suppress the contributions of the revolutionaries. They slowly nudge them out of the history books or sort of present them as sort of random acts of individual violence. But what they do further is actually inexcusable. I don't know if you realize this, that when you visit the Port Blair and you see the cellular jail, what you see there today is just two wings of the cellular jail. But it was a much bigger complex with many other radials. What happened to those other radials? Well, they were pulled down. In fact, even the ones that you see today were nearly pulled down till at the last minute it was stopped. And therefore, you have this little bit of it saved so that you can go and see it and remember what was done to these people. This memory was almost entirely wiped out. Similar thing was attempted and successfully so in many other places. I'll give you another example. Delhi, MAMC, Maulana Azad Medical College, yeah? It is built on the site of Delhi jail, where many revolutionaries were hanged. In the 1950s, it was decided that this jail would be closed, and there were, now there are many other places to build a college, but they had to be built on that site. Okay, fine. So when this was done, there were still some old revolutionaries left. Unfortunately, so they went and told the government and Nehru himself that, look, at least the part where the hangings used to happen should be converted into a memorial to the revolutionaries. This, Nehru agreed, the government agreed. But then when actually the construction started, they demolished it, and there is now a building on it. So this is how the memory of the revolutionaries was simply wiped out of our national sort of consciousness very, very deliberately. And instead, what happened is you see, for example, the INA soldiers. They were not only not taken back into the Indian army, they were not even given freedom fighter status for many decades afterwards. It's only in the 1970s that they were finally given some recognition as freedom fighters. Many of them died in penury. This also happened with the mutineers of the Royal Indian Navy revolt. Many of them also were none of them were ever taken back into the Indian Navy, and again, many of them died in extreme penury. And this happened systematically, by the way, to many of the revolutionaries. And this again brings me back to what happened to them. Do remember the three provinces. Of course, there were revolutionaries across India, but the three provinces that provided, three communities that provided the bulk of the revolutionaries, remember what will happen to them too. One was the Sikhs and Hindus of Punjab, Hindus of Bengal, and specifically the Brahmins of Maharashtra. These are the three communities that had provided a disproportionate number of the revolutionaries. And each case, see what happens to them. In Punjab and Bengal, they are partitioned. So at the moment that India became free, the revolutionaries who had sacrificed so much for India's freedom found that they themselves were foreigners in their own homes. So not only at the time of independence, you may ask, why didn't the revolutionaries manage to have a voice in post-independence India's politics? Well, this is what happened to them. All their top leaders were gone. Not a single one of their top leaders survived till independence. Netaji went missing, died, whatever your belief may be. Raj Bihari Bose and Sachin Sanyal, Bhagat Singh, Chandrasekhar Azad, all of them were dead. So the revolutionaries had no leadership, and their homes had been lost. East Bengal and Lahore were major hubs of revolutionary activities. And if you read my book, you will find Dhaka and Lahore, etc. mentioned. What happens to them? Using the excuse that Godse was a Maharashtrian Brahmin, the entire community was essentially faced genocide in some ways. So we all know about the 1984 riots in which the Sikhs were targeted. But do remember something very similar happened after Gandhi assassination. The entire Chitpavan Brahmin community, more generally the Maharashtrian Brahmin community, was targeted. Hundreds were killed. Their homes were burnt. And we never hear about this genocide. A lot is talked about Savarkar. Let me tell you about what happened to his younger brother, Narayan Savarkar, who was a great freedom fighter in his own right. I don't know, is Vikram here or not? Vikram Sampath, he's probably outside. but you can read more detail in his book, although I mention it in mine as well. Narayan Savarkar was dragged out of his house and stoned to death. He died. He would then essentially be in hospital for almost a year, never recovered, and would die. Godse was hanged for the death of an assassination of Mahatma Gandhi. I want to know who was hanged for the killing of Narayan Savarkar. In fact, Vinayak Savarkar himself narrowly escaped the same fate. A big mob of Congress workers, great believers in ahimsa, turned up at his house. And he was there with his kids, young kids, etc., and his wife upstairs. Thankfully, the mob was delayed long enough for the police to arrive. Otherwise, the same thing would have happened to him. And we hear long stories about how he was apologetic to the British and so on. Why were the Congress workers so afraid of this other narrative? So much so that to this day, they will make up utter bullshit stories about how he was in some way a collaborator of the British. If he was a collaborator of the British, they wouldn't have kept him in Kala Pani, I can assure you that. They would have kept him in the luxury wing of Naini jail. And they would not have kept him in house arrest for another 13 years in Ratnagiri. So this story of the revolutionaries was not merely about the story, their history of resistance being suppressed, but what happened afterwards in the way in which they themselves were pushed out of the national conversation systematically. The provinces they came from were divided and partitioned. They became homeless and leaderless, and even when they were not suffering partition, they were targeted specifically, as I told you, in the case of the Chitpavan Brahmins of Maharashtra, and pushed out of the conversation because they were seen as a threat to the continuation of a particular had come to power. They discovered, one, they had to push out other alternatives to their hegemony. And one of the groups they decided to take on board was, remember, that collaborator class. And of course, the collaborator class was very, very happy to be on board because now, you know, they were always good at collaborating. That's what they did for a living. And they were wondering what to do with themselves. And here was an opportunity for continuity. So as the British officials left, those who had collaborated and joined the administration in various forms, they were the one who benefited the most because they had got promoted and went up the stream. And it is they and their immediate descendants and direct descendants who became the administrative and intellectual elite of India after independence. This is the reason where you have a peculiar situation that the colonial era narrative that India was never a nation, never a country, etc., was continued. Because, you see, this was very important for what the collaborators were telling themselves. In any independent country, they would have been thought of as being traitors. But of course, if you could say that India was never a country before 1947, then of course, they could never have been a traitor to a country that did not exist. So it is very important to their own narrative that India is not a country, is not a nation before 1947. That is why it is important to say Gandhi is the father of the nation, because then 1947 ke pehle kuch nahi tha. Then you can have Chacha to the nation. Then you can have Damad to the nation. So this is the importance of that narrative. And also remember that a large number of British colonial officials continued to serve in the government. It is not that the next day they were thrown. ICS officers of Indian origin continued, but also British origin. Much of the Indian armed forces was run by British officials well into the 50s. The first Indian naval chief only took office in 1958, 11 years after India became independent, in the name of continuity. So, in the name of continuity, this entire regime continued. That is, therefore, the collaborator class below them also continued. They were very happy. And they were large. So when you go and dig a little bit, just do a little bit of digging, and you will be surprised how many people who are from this so-called intellectual class have their origins in people who made their money by becoming contractors to the British, or whose direct ancestors were working in the imperial police service. Just go and look it up. You'll be shocked. Just do a little bit of Google search and you'll be shocked. So of course, this particular narrative is important to this collaborator class. And many of these collaborator class then became the story writers about the whole thing. I have in my book, I've given the specific example of Yashpal. Those of you who read Hindi literature, now it turns out there is more than adequate evidence to show that he was actually a police informant. And it was based on his information that Chandrasekhar Azad was trapped in Alfred Park in what was called Allahabad and had to kill himself. Even better, the revolutionaries of that time were hunting for him. I know that members of my family were hunting for him. And so because he was hunting for him, the British actually faked a gunfight in which nobody got hurt, interestingly. And then he was arrested and put in jail. I forget which jail, Bareilly or some such place. Now, no self-respecting revolutionary was ever sent to Bareilly jail. They were sent to Kala Pani or Gonda or some such place. And even better, he was allowed to get married in jail and keep his wife in jail with him. So, these are the people who after independence then took on this mantle and became remembered as great revolutionaries or great writers and thinkers and so on. Also interesting is what happened to many of the remnants of British intelligence operations against the revolutionaries. So again, let me give you an interesting insight into this. Many of them have interesting afterlives. So for example, during the First World War, or a little bit before the First World War, there was a very large movement called the Gadar movement, which involved a big network inside India, led by Raj Bihari Bose and Sachindranath Sanyal, but worldwide as well by likes of Lala Hardayal and many others. And the Sikhs were a very important part of this, particularly Sikhs in North America, who were operating out of a network of Gurudwaras, also in other places, UK, Singapore, etc., but particularly North America. Now the British basically decided to break this movement by infiltrating those Gurudwaras. And we even know the name of the British agent, Hopkinson, who was the person put in charge and was given a large amount of resources to infiltrate the Gurudwaras. And so he infiltrated those Gurudwaras and he created again a bunch of collaborators. And their basic premise or their aim was to create a split in the Sikh community and specifically spew venom against the Hindus and split them off from the Hindus and also from the nationalist nationalist movement in general. Now do remember at that time, the Gadarites were aware that this was being done to them. And in many of the Gurudwaras of North America, there were gunfights between the collaborator loyalists and the nationalists. gunfights, and the Ghadarites then began to systematically kill the people who they were being British informants. So then what happened? Of course, the Ghadarites fight back, and many of these informants get killed. So one of these informants was Bela Singh, who turns up in a Gurudwara and shoots a couple of people dead. And it is seen by many people, and there's a court case, and everybody knows that, the British will ensure that this happens in British Columbia, by the way. So everybody knows that the British Columbia justice system is going to somehow find a way to free Bela Singh. So the court case is going on, and Hopkinson is supposed to come and bear witness on behalf of Bela Singh. So when he is entering the court, the witness box or whatever, a Ghadarite Sikh called Mewa Singh stands up, pulls out a revolver and shoots him dead in court. Now, nobody in India knows the story. Nobody in India probably has heard of Mewa Singh, but these were the kinds of people that were there. Now, Bela Singh, of course, Mewa Singh is captured, he's hanged. Bela Singh, of course, is exonerated, but he knows that they are hunting for him. So eventually it becomes so difficult for him to live in British Columbia, he actually escapes back to Punjab, which he thinks is safer. But then he is ultimately, I think, hunted down in Hoshiarpur and killed by the revolutionaries. But sadly, this infiltration of Gurudwaras continues even after the death of Hopkinson. And in case you're wondering, why is it that Canada, of all places, is the hub of the Khalistani movement? Well, let me tell you, the founder of the Khalistani movement is Hopkinson. So this is how this entire thing starts out. So there are all these remnants. Another interesting thing that is often forgotten is that till about 1930, there were virtually no revolutionaries who had anything to do with Marxism. When, very often you will hear, oh, the revolutionaries were Marxists. Actually, no, they were not. Many of them may have been today considered Hindu nationalists, if anything. Bhagat Singh indeed became, in the very end of his life, and by the way, it couldn't have been a very long life. He was only 23 years old when he was hanged. But towards the very end, he did embrace some amount of Marxist ideas. But it's interesting that in his very famous tract, Why I Am an Atheist, he himself writes that I am literally the only Marxist in the entire movement. In other words, his movement was not Marxist. The top leader of his movement, Sachindranath Sanyal, was vehemently anti-Marxist, as was Raj Bihari Bose and many others, and Sri Aurobindo as well. So the movement and its leaders were anti-Marxist of anything. So it's only in the 1930s you begin to see some Marxism sort of begin to spread in the revolutionary fold. And that happens interestingly. One is, of course, some part of some group of revolutionaries ended up in Russia after the First World War because they had nowhere to escape, and they were indoctrinated by the Soviets into this. So and therefore you have the CPI being formed in Tashkent. But even that is not really the source of the Marxist movement in India. The real source of the Marxist movement of India is very, very curious. And again, I have collected lots of interesting evidence of this. It comes from British jailers handing out Marxist literature to revolutionaries in British jails. Now, why on earth would they be doing this? Now, this is interesting, and again, as I said, there are many examples of this, of the British jailers giving out these, because they wanted to cause a split in the revolutionary movement and wean them away from the nationalists. So they thought that communist literature was a good way of causing a split. Now, am I just coming up with some sort of a conspiracy theory? No, there's more than adequate evidence that this happened. Also interesting is that now that these people had become communists, where did they end up? They ended up in the CPI. Now, the CPI had been formed in Russia, but in the 1930s, it was functioning in India, interestingly, under the control of British double agents. We even know their names. One of them was called Rajni Palme Dutt. Please read up on him. Okay, Rajni Palme Dutt grew up in Cambridge. He was half Swedish. By the way, related to Olof Palme, who was killed later. And Bengali, he and his brother were very much involved in the communist movement in Britain. But it's quite interesting if you read his correspondence with various people, including Nehru. It was very clear he was serving British interests. And of course, this became a very useful thing because in the Second World War, the communists would collaborate with the British against the revolutionaries. Now, yes, there were some revolutionaries who did take on Marxist ideas, but continued to be suspicious of imperialist and British and Russian interference. Now, that lineage of the revolutionary movement wasn't in the CPI. It ended up in something called the Revolutionary Socialist Party. Now, that party has almost died out today in today's India, but was a reasonably large party into the 50s, 60s, even into the 80s. So the Revolutionary Socialist Party is the remnants of that lineage of the Marxist lineage of the revolutionaries. They were originally called the Anushulan Marxists, deriving from the Anushulan Samiti of again, Sri Aurobindo. But it's interesting, on the very other end of the ideological spectrum, the other remnant of the Anushulan Samiti is, guess who? RSS. The RSS was founded by Heggevar, who was himself the Nagpur head of the Anushulan Samiti. He was very much a part of the Anushulan Samiti. He was in National Medical College in Kolkata. He started out as being a courier for guns and other literature and other things, and he had, interestingly, a code name Cocaine. Anyway, he comes back, he does various things during the First World War, trying to instigate revolts. Ultimately, he leaves the mainstream revolutionary movement and he sets up the RSS. Very interestingly, and I'm going to end with this, the pamphlet or the design of the RSS is again derived from writings of Sri Aurobindo. Please read a short 18-page pamphlet called Bhavani Mandir. Have you read? How many of you have read Bhavani Mandir? There are a few here. Read it from end to end. It's only 18 pages, and you will immediately see where the broad design of the RSS comes from. With that, let me stop and open it up for Q&A.
Such an interesting talk, Sanjeev. Just a quick question. There has been an attempt to say that Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose was himself socialist, if not, didn't have Marxist ideas. What is your take on that?
So Netaji was essentially a pragmatist. He didn't have very strong views on how society should be arranged, although he did participate in creating a planning board in the Congress while he was the Congress president. But if you read his own writings, it's quite interesting how he thinks of the right and the left. So in his own writings, and do remember that the term socialist did not have the connotations of economics that we have well into the 1930s. It was a generic term that many people used, even though you wouldn't call them socialist or the left. The idea of socialism was anybody who kind of, or the left, was anybody who had kind of radical views about pushing back against the existing colonial order. So in his own writings, you find Netaji refers to the likes of Lala Lajpat Rai, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, Sri Aurobindo, even Vivekanand as belonging to the left. So be very, very careful about the use of the term left. Left meant radical, not necessarily associated with sort of all these terms that we now have of a particular kind of economic planning or or secularism and so on. The left was a generic term, so many of the characters who we now consider from the right he would have considered from the left. The term socialism itself was a very vague term. By the mid-30s, it does begin to take some forms, particularly because of the growth of the Soviet Union and so on. So you begin in the 30s, beginning to see some sort of contours of what we would recognize as socialist left. But again, it would have been quite vague. There were many people using all kinds of terms more generally about it. So be very, very careful about using it. And in any case, Netaji himself was a pragmatist. I mean, if he was that ideological about it, he wouldn't have been willing to ally either with the fascists of Italy or Nazis or imperialist Japan and so on. He was, as far as he was concerned, his first agenda was freeing India, and he was willing to ally with whoever was necessary in terms of doing so. He was not at all ideological about it, and of course, in personal life, he was a very Kattar Shakta. That is well known.
Thanks for the mind-boggling session. I have two quick questions. One, I'm very happy that we are waking up now, but are we too late? Second question, Anand and Vikram Sampath were talking about how Gandhi was a fiction, and even his contemporaries were, they were promoting the Mahatma picture. Why was so? Even Patel didn't agree with, though he didn't agree with him, he budgeted for giving space to Nehru. Why so?
So of course, there's a great amount of deification of Gandhi that happens while he was alive, and of course very much after his assassination, which by the way was quite convenient to us also to the narrative. So the building up of Gandhi is very much a part of what happened, but do remember that within the Congress, forget the revolutionaries, there were many, many others who were quite uncomfortable with Gandhi's deification. Since you mentioned Sardar Patel, let me tell you that included Vittal Bhai Patel, who was his elder brother, who was quite suspicious of Gandhi, and and there was an entire faction in the in the Congress in the 1920s called the Swarajists, who were uncomfortable with Gandhi, which included C.R. Das, interestingly, and Vittal Bhai Patel, but it also interestingly included Motilal Nehru. Motilal Nehru's switch over to the Gandhians happens in the end of the 1920s, and it happens interestingly because Gandhi first helped him to become the president of the party, but then also arranged for his son to be his immediate successor. In a sense, he was bought out as a result of that politicking. This is exactly what Gandhi tries to do with Subhash Bose as well in the 1930s. That's why, by the way, the first time that Subhash Bose becomes president, it's actually with Gandhi's blessings. Where it goes wrong is that Subhash Bose, having become president, first of all, doesn't toe the Gandhian line in what he does, but then, and then he says, look, what I've been doing hasn't yet been finished, I want another term. And that is where the friction comes from. So, I'm not here to say that Gandhi did not have any contributions to the freedom struggle. That would be too extreme. There were many contributions to the freedom struggle, and Gandhi, even many of the revolutionaries accepted that he had a contribution. By the way, whether you read Sachin Sanyal's writings or even Netaji's writings, but at the same time, they were not so enamored by him to think that everything he did was right and sort of deified him. They saw him as an important political leader who was part of the whole spectrum that led to Indian freedom. Yes.
So it's really exhilarating whatever you are telling, but the point is that this literature would be read by most probably the people like us who are no longer going to school. When these things are going to come to the school, I have a kid who is in 10th standard. Actually, मैं उसका किताब पढ़ता हूँ तो हीन भावना से भर देता है भारत के बारे में. So when this is going to happen? Another question, just short. It is also said that Nehru informed about the presence of the revolutionary who was killed in that Bagh. Is it true? Because he had just met Nehru just before he was killed for asking for money.
Well, Nehru did indeed know that Chandrasekhar Azad was in Allahabad on that day, so that is true. But we do not have any direct evidence to suggest that he had provided that information. The best evidence we have is that it was Yashpal and another guy, I forget his name, something Tiwari. But mostly Yashpal who provided that information. So that is the best information we have. So I'm not going to speculate until I find some other new evidence on this matter. As far as textbooks is concerned, well, I have been pushing for this for a very long time. So I can't comment on the activities of another ministry or NCERT, but let me say that I have been pushing for it for a long time. I'm told that they are on the job.
Sanjeev, thank you. Coming back to Netaji Bose, what is your take on Gumnami Baba? I just wanted to know. I mean, I'm just trying
Well,
to...
I actually don't have a particular view. I'm intrigued by the idea of Gumnami Baba. I wouldn't completely write it off because he was a very interesting man, Netaji, and he was quite capable of doing something like this. And by the way, he had in earlier life once run away from home to become a monk. So he was capable of doing something completely out of the box. But am I somebody who spends a great amount of time thinking about this? No. The reason for that, at least as far as my book is concerned, do remember that for the purposes of my book, he is not, his afterlife is not relevant. He, for as far as the freedom struggle and the revolutionary movement is concerned, whether he goes missing or dies in that plane crash, subsequently he doesn't seem to play an important role, or at least we don't seem to have any evidence of him playing an important role. So consequently, I take an agnostic view about the matter. Whatever happened to him, as far as the story is concerned, he was dead.
Hand, because otherwise I wouldn't know whom to give the mic to.
One more question from me. Since you are part of the government and the revolutionaries are coming out in the book, as a part of Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav, what are the steps that the government is taking to elaborate the contributions of our revolutionaries?
So many things are being done. I mean, some are small, some are big, but certainly what we have done is, as part of the Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav, we have celebrated a much wider array of freedom fighters than would have been the case in the last 75 years. So whether it's in terms of putting a Netaji statue on Kartavya Marg, and you know, if you go there and see it, effectively what happens is that all subsequent Republic Day parades are done effectively to Netaji taking the salute. Similarly, if you've visited Kolkata and gone to the Victoria Memorial and gone to the insides of it, you will see that it's been converted to being Biplobi Bharat Museum, which is to Netaji and the other revolutionaries, and I had some small role in getting that done. There is, similarly, we are finally beginning to hear names such as Birsa Munda and so on, who are an important part of the conversation. Many people are completely ignorant that the Manipuri had a very important role in our freedom struggle. Probably utterly ignorant about it. They put up the last, they put up the last true resistance of any Indian traditional elite to the British in the 1890s. And the Manipuri royal family was then sent off to Kalapani before cellular jail was created, and they were put in a place what for a long time was called Harriet Hill. Just few months ago, Home Minister went to Andamans and he renamed that hill as Manipur Hill. Similarly, there is a cell, there has been now for some years a cell in cellular jail that was dedicated to Savarkar. There now is another cell that is now dedicated to Sachindranath Sanyal, who had been sent there twice. He's the only person to have been sent twice to Kalapani, once for 5 years and then subsequently for 10 years. So small things are being done, but in some ways, this is not a government effort. This has to be a national effort. And it is coming through in many, many small ways across the country. Even the movie RRR, fictionalized as it may be, brings out the memory of Alluri Sitarama Raju. Many people in this room may have never heard of him before this. And while I don't think he went to the governor's party and danced like that, it is a fact that he had a very remarkable life and a remarkable resistance to British colonial occupation of this country. So I think these stories are coming back. And of course, there is a longer history of resistance to foreign occupation of this country. That too is coming back. We are now beginning to hear about the likes of Lasit Borphukon or Durgavati and so on, which we simply did not hear. Even Rajdi, with now his, even somewhat reluctantly, is writing about Vijayanagar of all places. And maybe he has twisted, I haven't read the book, and I'm sure he has attempted to give it some secular twist. But the fact of the matter is, people are unable to keep these stories hidden any longer. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
You have 4 more minutes. Sanjeev, you have 4 more minutes.
I have 4 more minutes?
Yes.
Okay. So I can ask some more questions. Sorry, I can answer some more questions.
Good morning, sir. There has been a rewriting of history in these days. Is this too late or is this the right time?
There's no right time or too late. It's about every generation to go and dig. The point is, proper scholarship is needed, first of all. Our purpose is not to replace one bunch of lies with another bunch of lies. So proper scholarship is needed. For the first time, this is being attempted. Some of it is happening in academia. Finally, archaeological survey is also being slowly pushed ahead to begin to do new digs after a long time. You're also seeing people from the outside of the mainstream academic history mafia beginning to write books about history. Of course, with great amounts of complaints that we have not been, that the academia didn't have an opportunity to brainwash us, and therefore that is taken against us. But anyway, the point is, new facts are being dug up, being presented, these stories are being retold. And very importantly, these stories are finally beginning to reach the general consciousness as well. Look at the number of things that are being done. Amazon Prime and other OTT platforms have, for example, recently come Udham. Right? Growing up, I had actually never heard of Udham Singh. Hopefully, the next generation very much knows who Udham Singh is. And the incredible thing he did. He avenged Jallianwala Bagh massacre after 2 decades. And so on and so forth. So these stories are coming out, whether, as I said, the specific period of the revolutionaries, but also the longer history. There's a lot of renewed interest in, for example, Shivaji that is happening. Uday Kulkarni has written extraordinary books on the Peshwa period. You're beginning to see histories being written about other characters as well. So I think there is a revival of interest in our own history, being written by ourselves. And, in the past, a book on Aurangzeb with no references at all in it would have simply passed through without anyone challenging it. Today, it's being challenged. And you also have a situation where even those who, for example, even today you'll find books of Charles Allen everywhere. I mean, I find it extraordinary that a country like India accepts a blatantly racist histories and books written by the likes of Charles Allen, and they'll find them in ordinary bookshops. And I'm going to end by saying this. Just read a book he's written called Coromandel, okay? On the very first page, he writes something quite bizarre. So it's supposed to be a maritime history of the Coromandel course. He basically starts that chapter by saying that the Indians are a strange people that live next to this ocean and had no interest in the ocean. What? So in one fell sweep, he wipes out our entire maritime history. And then that allows him to only concentrate on the colonial period. I mean, the blatantness with which history is done. He's written a book on Ashoka, where there is a 20-page segment on Ashoka himself. The rest of the book is about how great the British were in having rediscovered him. I mean, it's just astounding. But anyway, that's how things are. For the first time, till a decade ago or so, we would just not have questioned him. In fact, he would have been brought to literature festivals and feted as a great Indologist. Today we mock him. That's the change. Thank you very much.